Okay, we're going to pick up again with the second part of the lecture on Danto, and now we are going to start talking about what I mean by the rhetorical effect of beauty, or what Danto talks about as the pragmatic kind of effects of artworks, and he winds up talking about beauty as a kind of inflector. But let's look at it. Okay, so Danto writes, quote, "Pictures have typically been thought of in semantic terms, with reference to what they are pictures of, where pragmatics would instead draw attention to what the pictures intended to get viewers to feel toward the latter." End quote. Danto calls beauty an inflector, something that is used to cause viewers to have a certain attitude to what is shown. As we have seen, there's a long history in aesthetics of connecting art with beauty, a pleasure that lifts us out of the practical concerns in life. At least that was the presumption. There was an assumption that good art would be aesthetically pleasing. That assumption was challenged and changed, as I mentioned before, around the turn of the last century, although we often still find it hovering under the surface of our ideas about art, such as in the critical reactions to the Whitney Biennial. The upshot is that beauty or aesthetic excellence is no longer necessarily the mark of artistic success or excellence. If an artist wishes their work to cause some other attitude, like disgust or outrageousness, or even aesthetic indifference, the mark of artistic excellence will be creating a work that effectively does that, whatever it is. Quoting from Danto, "If the aim of a painting is to arouse desire, it is appropriate that it be beautiful. If it is to arouse loathing, it is perhaps more appropriate that it be disgusting." End quote. Now that we no longer assume all artworks should be beautiful by default, we can see that every time an artist makes their work beautiful, this is a choice, and we can think about the pragmatic or rhetorical purpose behind that choice. What is the artist trying to get us to feel about the subject presented? And I'm going to include a quotation from Dave Hickey on this. Danto starts off his paper talking about Dave Hickey claiming that beauty is going to be the issue of the 90s. I haven't really talked too much about that, but Dave Hickey has a really interesting discussion of Robert Mapplethorpe's photographs. Devereux talks about them. I might talk about it a little bit more when I do the lectures on Devereux. If you took my philosophy of sexuality class, then you already have read Hickey on Mapplethorpe, and you will have seen these quotations before. But I think that, I don't know, it's just like kind of a snappy statement of the way that artworks shape our attitudes towards what they show. So here's Hickey, quote, "All images are potentially powerful. Bad graphics topple good governments and occlude good ideas. Good graphics sustain bad ideas and worse governments. The fluid nuancing of pleasure, power, and beauty is serious business in this culture. Images argue for things, for doctrines, rights, privileges, ideologies, territories, and reputations. The task of beauty is to enfranchise the audience and acknowledge its power, to designate a territory of shared values between the image and its beholder, and then, in this territory, to advance an argument by valorizing the picture's problematic content. Without the urgent intention of reconstructing the beholder's view of things, the image has no reason to exist, much less to be beautiful." End quote. All right, let's talk about the effect that beauty has from Danto's perspective. And I think in this quotation from Hickey, we see the idea that beauty can be a bit more aggressive in terms of playing a role in service to political aims in art. Danto's going to present a bit of a different view, which is that beauty kind of works to soothe us in relation to the content that it presents and put that content at a kind of philosophical distance. And Danto's going to use that account of the effect of beauty to argue that it's incompatible with artistic contents that are aimed at getting us to act, because beauty kind of puts us into a passive, accepting sort of mode rather than an active, angry, engaged kind of mode. So I think the passage from Hickey is also kind of useful because while he is talking about beauty enfranchising us, like bringing us into a way of seeing something, and kind of setting up an idea that we share values with the person who's presenting this thing to us as beautiful, because it inclines us to like that thing. The pleasure of beauty inclines us to like what is presented as beautiful. That can be kind of harnessed for political purposes. And we want to think about that, because I think it is at odds in a certain way if we think of using beauty for political aims that are active, that are about motivating people to get involved and start changing the world, then that would be at odds with the way that Danto is presenting beauty. But let's look more closely at what Danto actually has to say about beauty. So the first rhetorical use of beauty Danto considers is consolation. In particular, he talks about the beauty of Robert Motherwell's Elegies for the Spanish Republic. He thinks that beauty is internally related to the work of elegy. Quote, "Elegy fits one of the great human moods. It is a way of responding artistically to what cannot be endured, or what can only be endured." End quote. To quote from him again, "I feel we understand too little about the psychology of loss to understand why the creation of beauty is so fitting as a way of marking it, why we bring flowers to the graveside or to the funeral, or why music of a certain sort defines the mood of mourners. It is as though beauty works as a catalyst, transforming raw grief into a tranquil sadness, helping the tears to flow, and at the same time putting the loss into a certain philosophical perspective." End quote. And a last quote, "The conjunction of beauty with the occasion of moral pain somehow transforms the pain from grief into sorrow, and with that into a form of release. The effect of the elegy is philosophical and artistic at once. It gives a kind of meaning to the loss by putting it at a distance, and by closing the distance between those who feel it, who are in it, as we say, together." End quote. So in very broad terms, we might say that the pleasure of beauty helps us to accept what is before us, or to reconcile ourselves to it in the mode of consolation. But there are times when consolation is not the morally appropriate response, and so beauty also seems inappropriate. To quote from Danto again, "Think, to bring it back to the individual death, to which beauty itself is the human response, when one feels that death was not inevitable, though death abstractly considered is. Suppose one's lover has died of AIDS, and one feels that something should or could have been done. One feels anger that it has not been done. One blames and accuses. Then beauty, to which one is spontaneously moved, also seems wrong because one is called upon to act up, and not to philosophize. Then elegy conflicts with the impulse to counteraction and the prolongation of struggle." End quote. So here, Danto claims that beauty may be internally incompatible with some situations, and so the content or the thought of some works of art. There can be artistic content that calls for moral anger and action instead. And the upshot here is that beauty will only contribute to an artwork's artistic excellence if its content is internally related to beauty, or its content is something that is internally consistent with the effect that beauty has of putting something at a philosophical distance and kind of reconciling ourselves to it. And as a result of this take on beauty, the beauty of an artwork can even count against its artistic excellence if beauty is morally incompatible with the content of the work. As an example, Danto mentions Sebastião Salgado's photography, and I have given examples both of the Spanish elegies and Sebastião Salgado's photography in the Corcus page supplement for this week with images. You can take a look at them. But to quote Danto on this, "It is wrong at times to present as beautiful what calls, if not for action, then at least for indignation. Beauty is not always right. Sebastião Salgado's photographs of suffering humanity are beautiful, as his work invariably is, but have we a right to show suffering of that order in beautiful ways? Doesn't the beauty of the representation imply that its content is somehow inevitable, like death? Are the photographs not unedifyingly dissonant, their beauty jarring with the painfulness of their content? If beauty is internally connected to the content of a work, It can be a criticism of a work that it is beautiful when it is inappropriate for it to be so. End quote. So again, what I want to draw our attention to here is that Danto's arguments say that beauty might be inappropriate in the case of Sebastião Salgado's photography rests upon a claim about the effect beautifying something has in terms of our attitude towards that content. And for Danto, that effect is to make that content seem somehow inevitable, to place it at a philosophical distance, to reconcile ourselves to accepting things that way, etc. And we want to think, is that right? Is Danto right about beauty and what he's saying about beauty there? I think that he's certainly right that beauty plays this role in consolation that we do, and that perhaps we don't quite fully understand why, but that we turn to beauty for consolation in the wake of great loss. He's right about that, but I don't know if he's right to kind of make this the defining mood of beauty or the defining effect of beauty to then use to decide which sort of contents can be internally related to beauty in a morally acceptable way or not. But now, Danto does consider a potential problem with his account of the effect of beauty on our attitudes towards the content that's being presented. And that is, it arises for him when he reads a critic talking about Picasso's blue period. And so let's talk a little bit about this. Danto is going to consider another kind of effect that beauty can have, and that is relish, or a use that beauty can be put to, which is to make us relish the content that's presented. So, as I say, relish arises as a problem for Danto's idea that the rhetorical effect of beauty is consolation. Picasso did a series of paintings of imprisoned prostitutes, many of them suffering from syphilis, and they would live in this prison oftentimes with their children. These paintings, which are beautiful, we might think, but that something seems kind of off about the combination of beauty and suffering in this case. So Richard Dormant, a critic, points out of these paintings that their seductive beauty is at odds with the genuine misery on which they are based. Now Danto wants to preserve the idea that beautifying terrible things can be okay, since he needs to discover why it can be okay, as it is in the case of the Spanish elegies, and so he needs to discover why, in this case, Picasso's paintings, it is not. And the answer is basically that rather than using beauty to console or offer comfort in the face of tragic suffering, Picasso's beauty, or use of beauty, seems designed to entice us to enjoy the suffering of these women. The beauty of the paintings invites us to relish their suffering, rather than kind of reconciling us to the horror of it, or helping us mourn for them. So I'm going to quote from Danto on Picasso. Quote, "In a way, Picasso beautified the women because he relished the idea of a beautiful woman being caused to suffer. An ugly woman, or a woman rendered ugly by the harshness of her circumstances, blocks off the possibility of perverted pleasure. Think, after all, of the history of depicting female victims, naked and chained to rocks, awaiting their rescuers. No one presumably would be erotically interested in rescuing a hag or a woman shown starved and emaciated. But this means that by and large, beauty in the depiction of such victims comes in for moral criticism, connected with the fact that the gazer takes pleasure in the agonies of a beautiful female. Perhaps the right way to depict such victims from a moral point of view is to exclude any such pleasure, and hence to exclude beauty in favor of documentation or indignation. Beauty in such cases is not a consolation, but a relish, a device for enhancing appetite, for taking pleasure in the spectacle of suffering." End quote. There's lots that's interesting in this passage, and just in relation to Picasso. We can talk more about that if you like. For our purposes in kind of thinking about the philosophical argument that Danto's making here, what's most important is that this shows us that beauty can be used for different rhetorical purposes. There's at least consolation and relish. Are there more? These are the only two that Danto considers, but we want to be thinking, Is Danto missing something here? Are there other possible uses that beauty can be put to, or ways that beauty can relate to political purpose, say, that he hasn't considered? Right, so the most important claim Danto makes is not really what rhetorical uses beauty can be put to, but those it cannot. He does not think that it can be internally related to the content of artworks that seek to motivate us to political action. But can it? I want to think more about that and all the different forms that political action can take. For now, let's think about one other thing that comes up here. Danto bristles a bit at critics who consider Matisse, with his wonderfully beautiful paintings from his nice period. Many critics consider this period of Matisse, at least, to be inferior to Picasso, and he notes that these relative assessments of value seem to have to do with the florid beauty of Matisse's work. Quote, against these considerations, about Picasso thinking of women as suffering machines, it is somewhat difficult to accept Dormant's assessment that Picasso's general eschewal of beauty is what makes him an infinitely greater artist than Matisse, as if Matisse could not live without the consolation. It is something of a critical commonplace that the work of Matisse's nice period is inferior to his work from the period of blue nude, on just the grounds that it is almost floridly beautiful. I am not of that view at all. The beauty of these works is internal to their meaning. The world Matisse's works depict is a world of beauty, and the works themselves belong to the world they show. Matisse is absolutely coherent in this way, a hedonist and voluptuary rather than a sadist. He has sought to create a world which excludes suffering, and hence the pleasure that might be taken in it. Another dig at Picasso. They, the paintings from the nice period, put the harshness of the world at a distance, and in that regard belong to the same space as the elegies. What strikes me about this passage is the way that gendered values run underneath of it without quite being brought up into the sunlight and considered. Beauty has been considered feminine for a long time. In aesthetics, beauty was often contrasted with the sublime, which was considered to be more of a masculine aesthetic emotion or response. Again, we can talk more about that if you like, but setting that aside for now. In connection with women, beauty has often been considered frivolous and decorative, and as Danto mentions, also deceptive. Beautifying is kind of like a mask hiding the truth underneath. Requiring consolation in response to the harsh realities of life would also be something that's been associated with femininity, whereas to be masculine is of course to wish to see things as they really are and tough it out. This is just to say that the criticisms of Matisse here have a context in gendered values that Danto doesn't seem to think about, which is interesting, especially since the criticisms are kind of valorizing this sort of quite masculine idea that you've got to present harsh reality and see the harshness of reality for what it is without sugarcoating it. That doing that would be more valuable than, say, trying to soothe ourselves in various ways by making things pretty and beautiful, as a criticism of Matisse. So we'll talk more when we read Battersby about the way that sometimes when artists use things that are considered feminine in their artworks, they sort of don't come in for the same criticism there as women artists who use those things, so that there's kind of more room to roam given to male artists in terms of using femininity or feminine qualities in their work. Still, I think this gives us an example of a time where a kind of gendered value judgment about beauty and things that are quite pretty is coming into a criticism, or at least a negative relative value judgment between Matisse and Picasso. Let's just push on to the end. I was going to do 3 videos, but we're so close, I'm just going to keep going. Okay, so now let's kind of review in whole the main argument of Danto's chapter. He's laid the groundwork for it by exploring what the rhetorical function of beauty is in his view, and giving an account of artistic excellence as a matter of measuring how well a work achieved the artist's aims. Now we can put them together. He's ready to give his defense of the feminist works featured in the 1993 Whitney Biennial. To quote from him one more time, There was very little beauty in the show, but how, critically, could there have been if beauty would be incompatible with such contents? Their show was certainly different from the biennials of distant memory, with still lifes, landscapes, nudes, interiors, and portraits, contents in connection with which beauty could be internally related. But the contents of the artists of 1993 were addressing were not the traditional contents at all. Theirs were contents it would have been wrong to beautify. Their aim was to change people's moral attitudes, and beauty would have gotten in the way. It would have been artistically wrong. End quote. Let's think about the steps of this argument. And I have them broken down here, but I feel like I might revise them before I post the handout. Anyways, let's just see. Okay, steps of the argument. Step number 1. In general, the rhetorical effect of beautifying things is to encourage a kind of passive or peaceful acceptance, putting them at a distance or in philosophical perspective. There are exceptions where beauty is used as a device for enhancing the appetite, in which case its rhetorical effect is relish. But primarily, Danto's view is that the rhetorical effect of beautifying things is to put them at a philosophical distance. Okay, so that's the first part of his argument, his claim about what beauty does to our feeling about the subject matter of an artwork. Step number 2. As a result of this, some contents are internally related to beauty, namely contents for which this attitude of philosophical distance can be appropriate, while others are not. The third step. It can be morally wrong to beautify some contents that are internally incompatible with beauty, say if one has good moral reason to resist slipping into a passive or philosophical attitude towards them. So this is important to bring out. At times, it sounds like Danto is saying it's morally wrong to beautify certain kinds of contents, when it would be morally wrong to think philosophically about something that demands direct action, direct intervention into some kind of suffering or injustice that is happening before one. And then as a separate point, our fourth step, it can be artistically wrong to beautify some content if the artist aims to move us to political action rather than getting us to kind of sort of passively accept and take pleasure in the way something is. The next step, there could be a further moral worry about creating any beautiful works of art in a world with such injustice and devastation. And I didn't talk about this explicitly, but Danto does consider this in his discussion. It's possible that spending our time thinking about creating beautiful artworks there's something kind of morally troubling about that. If the problems of the world are such that we should not be spending our time doing anything but trying to change it, basically. And then the sixth step, if we want to make beautiful artworks without moral worry, we may need to change the world first. And that's kind of an upshot for thinking about the art world at that moment that Danto was writing in the 90s, thinking if the art world wants to return to creating beautiful landscapes and portraits, etc., then perhaps we shouldn't be directing our ire towards the artists of the 1993 biennial. We should be directing our energies towards changing the world so that it can be morally okay to reflect the world in beautiful artworks again. So those last two claims aren't really as central to my concerns or to the assignment that I'm going to give you. It's possible to write your first paper on Danto, and there I want you to really think about his argument for it being morally wrong and artistically wrong to represent certain contents as being beautiful if the aim of the artwork is to motivate a certain kind of engaged action, that would be incompatible with beauty because beauty kind of sets us back into a passive mode. I want you to think about that idea critically.